Hi, I'm Peter Schertz. I'm the Jack and Marianne Frabel Curator of Ancient Art, and I'm going to be giving you a tour of our current exhibition, Treasures of Ancient Egypt, Sunken Cities. As you can see, I do not have a mask, but generally everybody who comes to the museum these days is wearing a mask and we're keeping socially distanced. Behind me you can see one of the spectacular finds from this exhibition. It is an image of a god, the largest image of a god ever found in ancient Egypt. The god's name is Hapi, H-A-P-Y, and he was the god of the Nile inundation. So a really important fertility god from more than 2,000 years ago. So without further ado, let's go down to our lower exhibition galleries and see the rest of this spectacular exhibition. This is a wonderful exhibition. It has more than 280 objects on view. Almost all of them come from underwater excavations carried out off the coast of Egypt in a region called Abu Khair Bay. The exhibition was organized by underwater archaeologist Frank Godio, who runs the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, known by its acronym ESAM, with the generous support of the Hilti Foundation and the collaboration of the Ministry of Antiquities of the Arab Republic of Egypt. We're going to dive right into this. On the tour I'm about to give you, we'll stop and see some of the highlight objects and talk about some of the themes and issues that run throughout this wonderful exhibition. Come, let's go on. So our first stop in the exhibition is in a section called Time. This section is to help orient visitors to the chronology of the exhibition. Almost all of the objects in this exhibition come from the late period of Egypt that begins with Dynasty 26 and 664 and continues on through the end of pagan antiquity during the Roman Empire when the Emperor Theodosius I outlawed the worship of the pre-Christian gods. And our first object in this section, and the most imposing of the objects, is this image of a queen. She's a queen from the great dynasty of the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies are Macedonian Greeks who conquered Egypt with Alexander the Great in the year 332. They set up their own dynasty under Ptolemy I Soter, Ptolemy I the Deliverer. In 305, he begins to rule as pharaoh. And the last of the ruling Ptolemies is Cleopatra VII Philopater, Cleopatra VII who loved her father. One of the fascinating things about the Ptolemies is the cleverness that they set up their rule. How they convinced the Egyptians, and Egypt is a vast country, enormously wealthy, heavily populated, and there are just a few thousand of these Macedonian Greeks initially. And the challenge for the Ptolemies was, how do we rule over this land? How do we convince the Egyptians that we're legitimate rulers? And we'll talk about some of the ways they do that throughout the exhibition. But one of the things that happens is the artistic cultures of Greece and Egypt are combined in Ptolemaic art. And you see that in this queen. If you look at her, she's very, very stiffly posed. That's typical of Egyptian art, which sought to emphasize the idea of stability and the eternal ruler. If you were to go behind her, you would see that there's a pillar that supported her in the back. Again, it helps stabilize the image, but it's a blank pillar. In Egyptian art, you would normally have hieroglyph inscriptions saying who is being depicted and often why, if it's a dedication to a god or a temple, but you would have information. The Ptolemies didn't do that with this. Very Greek also is the rendering of her hair. That's a Greek hairstyle. But the clothing has an Isis knot. It's similar to Egyptian styles. The Ptolemies create this amazing hybrid culture that combines the Greek and Egyptian elements in art, but also in government and religion. So let's move on to our next stop, which focuses on the concept of place. Where were these cities? Why did they matter? Remember that Egypt is an enormous country in antiquity that develops along the Nile River, and it's one of the earliest and greatest civilizations of Africa. But many of the objects in this exhibition come from the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, and they date from a time when Egypt is in increasing contact with the rest of the Mediterranean world. So the cultures of the Near East, for instance, the Phoenicians and the Babylonians and the Greeks, and of course later the Romans who dominate the Mediterranean by the 2nd century. One of the most important finds that Gaudio discovered is the stele. It's called the Stele of Thonis Heraklion. And it's really interesting because what had happened is Gaudio began his excavations looking for 3 different cities that we knew from ancient texts. The city of Thonis, the city of Heraklion, and the city of Canopus. When they discovered the stele, in the hieroglyphs it records the name of Thonis. So great, they found Thonis, one of the 3 cities. But they found it in a place that they knew from other excavated material and literary sources was also called Heraklion. And they put it together and they realized Thonis and Heraklion are exactly the same city, but it has an Egyptian name and a Greek name. This is a document that's incredibly well preserved and seems to have been deliberately preserved in antiquity. It records a tax decree. Now we think taxes. Nobody likes taxes. But this is a decree from one of the last of the native Egyptian rulers of Egypt, Nectanebo I, who establishes Dynasty 30. And he says that the import and export taxes from the city of Thonis, and again, Thonis in Egyptian, Heraklion in Greek, are to support the temple of Neith in another city in Egypt called Sais. And the priests of the temple apparently wanted to preserve this when Egypt was being ruled by Persians or the early Macedonians, so that they could eventually say, yes, and remember, you should bring back the taxes and the benefits that used to accrue to our city. So remember, this is a city on the Mediterranean coast, and it's a major port of trade. So it's very cosmopolitan, and you'll see that in our next stop. Thonis Heraklion is a trade city. It attracted people from all over the Mediterranean. And you see that in this case of jewelry, where we have some objects from the Near East, we have objects from the different parts of the Greek world also. These sort of crescent-shaped earrings that you see here, those are Near Eastern. And you see that throughout this exhibition, this wonderful confluence of cultures in it. Some of the bowls that were found in a temple of Amun-Gareb, which we'll talk about in our next stop, those also come from Near Eastern sites. And one of the things that this indicates is not just the eclectic population, but these objects were found in the temple of Amun-Gareb also. And it suggests that foreigners were also coming to Thonis Heraklion and worshiping the local gods, which makes perfect sense in a polytheistic culture. Polytheistic culture is one where they believe in many gods. And the peoples of the ancient Mediterraneans mostly were polytheists. And part of that system is that when you're traveling, you accept the local gods because they're the gods of that place, and you give them honors. When an Egyptian goes to Phoenicia, they would probably stop in the local temples and honor the local gods also. That was part of the system. And this jewelry really makes that point, because some of it comes from Greece, some of it comes from the Near East, some of it is clearly Egyptian. At our next stop, we're going to talk about the temple of Amun-Gareb itself, the major religious shrine in Thonis Heraklion. and a place where every new pharaoh came to get legitimacy to rule from the gods. So I'm standing here next to another naos. We saw the naos of the decades as we walked through the introductory section. And a naos is a Greek word that means dwelling place of a god. And this is the dwelling place of the god Amun-Gareb. Amun was one of the most important gods in Egypt, particularly in the late period and in the Ptolemaic period. Behind this object, you can see a photo mural of part of the city of Thonis Heraklion, and the big building that dominates this photo mural, that's the temple of Amun-Gareb. And if you look next to it, there's a smaller sanctuary to Amun's son, Khonsu the child, and we have his naos at the other end of the photo mural. What's great about being able to see the naos up close is you can look at it and you'll see these little dowel holes in the stone in the front. Those are for doors, because every morning those doors would be opened, the cult image of Amun-Gareb would be taken out, given new clothes, new food offerings would be placed in front of him, and he would reside outside of his dwelling place during the day. At night, the priests would come, they would put him back in the naos, and they would close the doors, all snug and tight for the night. Other finds in this section of the exhibition, as I mentioned with the jewelry, come from the temple of Amun-Gareb, and it's part of the most fascinating part of this exhibition, is that we see things like a display of bronze instruments that come from the temple, and they help us understand what was it like to be in an ancient temple, what were the practices, what kind of temple furnishings existed. We don't really have that type of information from ancient temples, but we see it in this exhibition. So we're going to go on now, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Egyptian religion with three of the primary gods, Osiris, Isis, and their son Horus. So these are enthroned images of two of the most important gods of ancient Egypt. They're brother and sister, but also husband and wife. They could do that because they were gods, not mortals, and the rules of mortals don't necessarily apply to ancient gods. Their names are Osiris and Isis. Osiris is holding its typical attributes of a crook and flail. These are agricultural symbols. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris is the first king, and these two symbols become symbols of royalty for all later Egyptian pharaohs. Isis is his wife and a sister. She's a goddess of magic, often, and they have a son named Horus. In the case behind me, you're able to see images of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. They're called the Osirian triad. And it's one of the principles of Egyptian religion is that it's often organized. Gods often come in the form of triads, generally a father, a mother, and a child. So there's recreation, it's a divine family that echoes human families. Osiris and Isis are two of the major gods of ancient Egypt. In Egyptian mythology, they have two additional siblings, Nephthys, another goddess, and Seth, a god. Osiris is the oldest, and Seth is quite jealous. Seth wants to be king, so he tries various ways to get rid of Osiris. First, he locks him in a box and hides the box, but Isis, the loyal wife and sister of Osiris, finds the box. This enrages Seth, who tears Osiris into 14 pieces and scatters the pieces across Egypt. Isis has to find all of those pieces. When she does, she reassembles them and she creates the first mummy. So this is what's called an etiological myth a myth of origins, of causes. It explains why there are mummies. Isis makes the first mummy. And remember, in early Egyptian civilization, only the royal family gets mummified. So again, first king, first mummy, and it's the paradigm for the royal family. So let's go learn a little bit more about this myth at our next stop that shows Osiris on his funeral bed. This is one of the most unusual and surprising images in the exhibition. It shows the god Osiris on his funeral bed. He's been reassembled by Isis, who remembers as a magician. And Isis has turned herself into a kite, a bird of prey. She's landed on Osiris, she's standing on top of him, and she's about to use her wings to beat the breath of life into her husband. And at the same moment that Osiris returns to life, he and Isis conceive a child, Horus, their son. And Osiris recedes from this realm into the netherworld of the Egyptians. And he rules in the netherworld. This is the land where people who die in our world strive to get into the netherworld, which is a world much like this one, but better. That becomes the realm of Osiris. And Horus, the son that Osiris and Isis are conceiving now, he grows up and he becomes both the heir and avenger of Osiris. So Horus grows up and he defeats Seth. And Seth represents for the Egyptians the idea of chaos. His realm, once he's expelled, once he's defeated by Horus, becomes the deserts that surround the Nile Valley, the land of chaos. And Horus restores order to the Nile Valley, which includes things like fertility. But it's this myth of Osiris being resurrected by Isis that becomes a really important kind of metaphor for the Egyptian world. Just as Osiris is restored to life, so is the land of Egypt restored to life every year through the flood of the Nile. And to make sure that happens, every year there's a celebration in the month of Khoiak. The month of Khoiak falls at the end of the Nile inundation. So remember, every year in ancient Egypt, the Nile floods, gathers waters from the highlands of Africa, that water rushing down thousands of miles of river, gathers silt and other nutrient-rich dirt, and overflows the banks of the Nile. And when the waters start to dry up at the end of the raining season, at the end of the flood season, they deposit that silt onto the banks of the river, and that becomes the agricultural land. So in a year of good flood, there's a lot of land that you can grow food in, otherwise Egypt's a desert. In a land of bad flood, it's a year of famine. And you don't get to grow a lot of food because the soil, the flood waters and the deposits of the soil just don't extend very far from the river's banks. So this story exists in the Hebrew scriptures with this idea of the 7 fat years followed by the 7 lean years. That's actually what happens in Egypt. You have years of great abundance with a good flood and years of shortages with a bad flood. But to make sure that there's always going to be a good flood year and a good harvest, the Egyptians perform ceremonies in Khoiak where they create fertility figures. And that's what we explore in the next part of this exhibition. So every year, the priests inside the temple, far from the eyes of the general public, create a figure that we call the Osiris Vegetans. It's a fertility image. And the way they do it, they take silt from the Nile, and remember this is at the end of the flood season when the waters have receded. They take that silt, they mix it with seeds, and they put it in 2 golden molds, one for each half of the figure. When the mud sets, they take them out of the golden molds, they join them and they wrap them in linen. And in elaborate versions like this, they create a face and a head for Osiris and put him in the box. This box happens to look like a falcon, the avatar of Horus. Once they create the image of Osiris Vegetans and wrap him in linens, they then deposit him in a basin. We have an example of a basin behind us. It's made from pink granite, and then they water it with sacred waters of the Nile. And of course, what happens when you have mixed seeds with dirt and you apply water? Well, some of them are going to sprout. And that's a symbol of what's going to happen in the coming year. It's a symbol of the fertility of the land and how Osiris brings fertility of the land. And it gets into one of the themes of the exhibition, which is the cyclical way the Egyptians think about the universe. So just as the sun rises every morning and brings light and life to the earth, and then descends at night into darkness and chaos, that's how the Egyptians conceive of the universe. That's the story of Osiris. He is a god who rules in this realm. He's killed by his brother Seth. He's brought back to life. He is renewed by the magic of Isis. And he goes into the netherworld, a realm away from our world, and continues to rule there. So again, it's a cycle. And for people who are totally dependent on the annual flooding of the Nile, the Egyptians perhaps felt these cycles more than any other people in antiquity. And other cases in this gallery, and again, this is what's really unusual about the exhibition, you can see some of the implements used to create the Osiris Vegetans, and a second figure also created in the month of Koyak called the Osiris Sokar figure, which instead of having just seeds in it, has about 14 different types of materials in it, including precious stones like lapis lazuli, but also other materials like myrrh and very expensive incense. And that's both of these images are created during the Koyak festival and paraded out in public view, a theme explored in the next gallery. So the creation of the Osiris Vegetans figures and Osiris Sokar, that takes place in the temple. The public's not involved in it. The public isn't allowed to enter into the temple. Only priests are able to, only consecrated individuals. But this is also a popular festival. It's a festival for all of the people of Egypt to come and celebrate their gods, to celebrate the beginning of the growing season, and to rejoice in the expectation of a new harvest. So there are thousands of people involved in it. And in this corridor that includes the image of a sycamore boat that Gaudio discovered, the only sycamore boat out of the 75 wrecks that he found in the waters around Thonis Heraklion. But in this corridor, we have objects that ordinary people were dedicating to their gods. So we have things like these lead boats that are actually very similar to some of the excavated finds, including with thrones where an image of a god could be placed on the actual boats because there's a procession of the gods during the Koyak festival. Again, this is a great religious celebration. You had music, and we have bells and a type of ratocultus sistrum in one of these cases. You had people making offerings. One of the navigations, as they're called, one of these processions of the gods that took place on the waters, took place at night, and it was lit by 365 lamps, one for each day of the Egyptian year. Other objects in this exhibition include more than a dozen bronze ladles. And you think, ladles, that's kind of a weird thing. But remember, these ladles were being used ritualistically to water the Osiris Vegetans figures. So they're associated with Osiris, and they're found in the waterways because once something has been given to the gods, according to ancient Egyptian texts, they belong to the gods. They can't be used by humans. So you either burn them, you cast them into water, or you otherwise damage them so they can't be used. Other objects in this exhibition include these images of gods that were placed on poles. So you can imagine thousands of people gathering at nighttime, lamplight, moonlight, whatever, and they're shouting, they're singing, they're praying, there's music, they're burning incense, they're carrying images of the gods on poles, and the crowd, there are offering dishes that were found in specific locations on the route of the navigation where people could make food and drink offerings to their gods. It must have been an amazing outburst of vitality and of excitement. And again, it's all to celebrate that we're planting our new crop. This is going to be a new year. Welcome to it. So this last gallery really brings home the point of change and continuity in Egypt. Again, as I said at the beginning of this tour, most of the objects come from late period Egypt, so from 664 through the Roman period. And that's when these things date from. But Egypt is a civilization that began around 5,000 years ago. So we're talking about 2,500 years ago. So half of that time. And it's a civilization that has tremendous continuity, even at a time of tremendous change under the Ptolemies and the Roman rulers. And you can see that in this image of what's called the Apis bull. Apis is a very early god of Egypt. He's attested in the Old Kingdom, so again, about 5,000 years ago, he's being worshipped. And he's one of the only true animal cults of ancient Egypt. Egyptian gods often have attributes of animals, and that's to help convey some of their powers. But very few gods are actual animals and worshipped as animals. But Apis is always a bull. There's only one incarnation of Apis on earth at a time. And when Apis dies, the entire country of Egypt goes into mourning as if the pharaoh has died. And the priests have to identify the new incarnation of Apis, which they do by tracing out specific features. So on his back, there'll be an image of the wings of a hawk. His tongue will have a kind of lump that looks like a scarab. A scarab is a dung beetle who's identified with the sun in ancient Egypt. So Apis is a god associated with prophecy, but what's really fun about this image of Apis, it's 2 meters tall, almost 2 meters long, but it dates to the reign of Hadrian, and we know that from the inscription that you can see on the side of it that records the name of the Emperor Hadrian. He's a Roman emperor of the 2nd century, so about 1,800 years ago, and yet he's giving honors to a god that had already been worshipped in Egypt for 3,000 years. So again, although he's a Roman, there's tremendous continuity in the religious life of ancient Egypt. But there's also a lot of innovations. And we'll see that in our last stop when we talk about a god whose name is Serapis, the combination of the name Osiris and the name Apis. So if the image of Apis dedicated by the Emperor Hadrian shows continuity of Egyptian religion, many of the objects in this section show change, how old gods have new forms, such as figures of a god called Osiris Hydreios, a Roman innovation, or this god whose name is Serapis. And Serapis is literally an invented god by the Ptolemies. According to ancient literary sources, Ptolemy I, the founder of the dynasty, has a dream. And in his dream, a cult image speaks to him and says, "You must bring my image to the new city of Alexandria, and I will become the patron deity there." Ptolemy sends to the city, and some sources at Sinope on the Black Sea coast of modern-day Turkey, and he brings the cult image. And when the image arrives in Alexandria, religious experts identify it as an image of the Greek god of the underworld, Hades. And they named the god Osiris Apis, because while Hades is the god of the Greek underworld, Osiris rules the Egyptian netherworld, the Egyptian world where the dead of our realm go to dwell. So they're conflated as gods of the underworld, but also of prosperity. Remember, Hades and his Roman name is Plautos, meaning wealth, and Hades is the god of all of the riches beneath the ground. So wealth and abundance, just as Osiris as a fertility god is a god of abundance. And the original image, and this is a close copy of the main cult statue of Alexandria, the god held a staff in his left hand, and in his right hand he rested it upon the figure of Cerberus. That's the three-headed guardian of the Greek underworld. And we know this from, again, ancient literary descriptions, but also versions of this image. One of the amazing things about this object is that it's made from sycamore wood. Sycamore wood is sacred to the god Osiris and is associated with life. But wood doesn't survive time very well. So there must have been hundreds, thousands of cult images made out of wood. Almost none of them have survived. Part of that is because of the nature of the material, and part of it is because with the rise of Christianity, cult images were systematically destroyed because they were trying to replace the ancient polytheistic gods. So you wanted to get rid of their imagery. So cult images on any medium, whether it's bronze or marble, a different stone or wood, they almost never survive from antiquity. But this one has. And when you look closely, you can see traces of ancient paint on it, especially pink and blues in the folds of the garments. You can see traces of white plaster on his head, on his face, on his neck. That was probably a surface to which gilding was applied. Gilding is just a thin sheet of gold, and it's because gold is really important to the Egyptians. They believe the skin of the gods is gold. Gold is the color of the sun, but it's also a perfect medium because it never tarnishes. So just as the gods are perfect, their skin must have been perfect. And just as the sun gives life to this world, the gods ensure that life also. So again, you can sort of sense how complicated the Egyptians thought about their gods and about their world with it. Serapis becomes a god who is worshipped all over the Roman Empire. So not just in Egypt itself. So even though he starts out as a god that the Ptolemies create to unify the people of Egypt, he becomes a universal god, as it were, in the empire. And you have cult centers for Serapis in England and the Balkans and the Near East. I hope you've enjoyed this tour of Sunken Cities. It's only a tiny taste of an incredibly rich exhibition, and the topics and issues I've addressed are only some of the many stories that this exhibition tells and that you can explore by coming in person. When you do, please wear your mask. If you forget your mask, we have them at the entrance of the museum. And I thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you soon.